All right. So this is an exciting one. One of the things you guys, for those of you who don't know me, will realize that for some reason I have an aversion to doing live workthroughs with stuff running. I think I'll date myself. I came up in the days when we would have a special LCD panel and I would run a virtual hard drive with a virtual PC running Dynamics on it to go demo to people. And it was always awful and stuff would crash and go crazy. And I still thought it was slick and modern. So now I'm very risk averse. I said, let me just stick to slides with lots of screenshots in them. But I do have a little bit of video in here too. So this is the first time I've presented this particular content. So I'm not rehearsed. I'm not well timed. Guys, I want to respect everybody. So if I start pushing the time limit, just cut me off. I'll record it later and give it to everybody. I want to make sure all the speakers have time. When do I have until the top of the hour?
Yeah.
So 45
Actually,
minutes.
You're going to take an hour. Yeah.
Okay, so I will stop at the top of the hour, and if I don't, please stop me. I'll try to move through it as quickly as I can, but again, I haven't rehearsed it, so I don't know quite how long it's going to take. So I know this is Power Platform User Group, and this is Dynamics 365 and Canvas Power Apps better together. So I will be talking about some Power Platform things, but I'll also be talking about Dynamics. But for those of you who don't know, when I talk about Dynamics 365, I'm really just talking about a model-driven Power App. So what I'm really talking about is embedding Canvas Power Apps inside of model-driven Power Apps and what that looks like, what it means, and how to get those things done. One of the first things I wanted to start with was this. I don't know if you knew this or not, but in Dynamics 365, in model-driven Power Apps, there's something called Dialogs, and there's something called Task Flows. Dialogs has been around for a long time. It's sort of what you would imagine, a pop-up dialogue that can have some interaction with the user and then can update the backend database after that interaction. Task Flows, kind of similar. They were just a more modern version of Dialogs. Both of those, Microsoft has said, are being deprecated. So still supported now. Not sure when they'll completely go out of support, but probably fairly rapidly. So what do you do if you're using those to replace them? If you're not using them, that's fine. You'll find the new option here as we get into it. If you're already using workflows in Dynamics, the heir apparent to workflows is Power Automate. Now, workflows are not dialogues or task flows. Those are something else. You've probably done workflows maybe in SharePoint or something else using kind of backed up by the old Microsoft workflow engine. They're still there. They're still supported. Workflows have not formally been deprecated in Dynamics yet, although it would not surprise me if that announcement was forthcoming. Microsoft recently announced they're deprecating some old SharePoint ones. Dynamics might be next on the chopping block because Power Automate does most, not everything, but most of what workflows do and a lot of what they don't. But today's topic, so what about these other two things, dialogue and task flows? What do those get replaced with? Dialogues can actually in part be replaced with Power Automate. I'm going to start with a really quick bit on that. If you're using model-driven apps, how that might work. But more for most of them, you're going to be looking at either Canvas Power Apps or the new immersive business process flows. I'm not going to talk about immersive business process flows at all today, just going to focus on Canvas Power Apps today. But before we jump into that, let's talk about this idea of, well, can I do some dialogue types of things without even having to get into Power Automate? And the answer is, yeah, you can. So if you look at this, I'm going to kind of walk you through with these numbered screenshots here as we go through it. To create a dialogue in a model-driven app or in Dynamics 365 without having to create a Power App with just using Power Automate. If you go into Power Automate, do a My Flow, do a new flow, and do an instant flow. And then you can do an instant flow that's triggered when a record is selected. For those of you who don't know what that means, instant flows that get triggered when a record is selected means on a given record in whatever solution you're using, it can be in Teams on a message, or with Dynamics or with model-driven apps, it can be just a record that's an opportunity record or an activity record or whatever. It's basically saying the user is there and they can manually choose to trigger this Power Automate, trigger this flow. So it's triggered when the user selects a record and chooses to run it. And to set it up, you go in here, you say, okay, what's the environment I'm in? What's the entity? What's the model-driven entity that it's going to appear on? And then if I want a dialogue, I have this other option where I can add an input to the screen. So what that means is, if I click that add an input, I have all these different variables that I can ask the user about when I configure the screen with them. It's just as simple in Power Automate as pick which types of questions I want to get answers to. As I add those different questions to the form or to the Power Automate, I can even go through and configure these. So I could say, hey, it's text, but although it's text, I want it to be a combo box or a drop down or a pick list or something like that. And then I can kind of choose all sorts of different things I can do with that. I want it to be a URL, whatever I want those things to be. So essentially, I'm saying the user is going to trigger this. And as soon as this Power Automate executes, the user has to answer all these questions before it will continue. As an old Dynamics guy and the guy who knows model-driven apps well, I think this is kind of cool because workflows you almost always had scenarios where you'd say, I want to run a workflow now, but I'd like to get two more things from the user. And in a model-driven app, your option was either do a dialogue, and dialogues are super clunky, or you have to add to the data model and say, well, before you start this, just fill out these other fields on the form. Well, maybe I only need those fields for the workflow, and I don't want to retain them in the data model. This allows me to create these temporary variables I can use in the context of my Power Automate, my flow, and then when I'm done with them, I don't have to use them anymore. Now, in my model-driven app, when I go to the main command bar and I pull it down and look, there'll be an item in there that says flow. If you've not seen that in model-driven app, it's been there for a while. That's what's behind this. So when I created that triggered by the user on an entity, it basically says, okay, that means it's going to show up here in flow. So as a user, I just go click flow and it says, here's the mini dialogue that I just showed you how to create. Okay, great, run that mini dialogue. When I run that mini dialogue, it shows me all the fields that I just defined. And when I'm done setting those however I want to set them, I can click run the flow. And now all those fields plus anything in the model-driven app are available to the flow in the context of whatever it needs to do. Calculations, updating things, sending emails, whatever it is. So that's the way you can create a dialogue type of experience with very little. I'm not a developer, and I always look for what's the thing I can do that requires the least amount of technical expertise, the easiest way for me to set it up. Power Apps to me is kind of the next level of magnitude of complexity over Power Automate. So I like going to that first, but you get a lot of functionality that we'll talk about in a Canvas Power App that you certainly don't with the others. Quick introduction to me. Name is Geoff Ables. I've been running a firm here in the southeastern part of the country for not quite 20 years yet, geeking out on things like customer and employee experience. So my sweet spot is this idea of digital relationships, I guess is the way I'd put it, not to replace the human touch, but to help us go broader and deeper with each other relationally than we could without it, and how to make that work in businesses. So it's led us to be kind of a Microsoft 365 practice, a Dynamics 365 practice, and those two combined, of course, have caused us to converge into the Power Platform space as well. And I've written a couple of books on the topic. All my contact info is there. On the personal side, there's a little bit of stuff about my family. My wife and I are relatively recent empty nesters. We love it. We love having an empty nest. It gives us more time to ride our Harley Davidson together and to drink wine together. We don't often mix those two things. Added the new pup to our family to fill in the gaps created in the empty nest. And the little guy on the lower right-hand corner there is our first grandson, born right as COVID was starting, the day after St. Patrick's Day. And he's sporting an awesome onesie there. So hopefully I can get to know you guys better too. Any riders here, by the way? I know Ed used to be. I don't think he's a flyer, not a rider now. Any other bike riders?
Yeah, I ride. This is John.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. We need to connect.
Night rod and a Ducati.
Okay. Well, I won't be able to keep up with you, but we can still try to ride.
Yeah.
What's your puppy's name, Geoff?
Her name is Verdi. She's a rescue. And we probably would have given her that name ourselves had we thought of it, but she was named when we got her. And Verdi is actually a cheap, sparkling wine that you can kind of get at Walmart. It's a brand called Verdi. Apparently, the person who adopted them or fostered them had all these pups, and she named them all after wines. She said, you can rename her. Like, that's a great name. We're going to stick with it. So Verdi.
Well, that's awesome, and great to see that you've written books. And I think what your whole firm is centered around is so important, especially, just client-centric, digital transformation-centric. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Plenty of work to keep everybody busy. Okay, so diving into the content. So, and forgive me, I know some of the stuff you guys, some attending this may go, oh my gosh, I'm way beyond this. I always kind of assume very little knowledge. So if I'm talking beneath a few of you, I promise I'll probably have some things to share that'll be revelations to you later, but I don't want to talk over anybody's head. So when you look at Power Apps, there's really 4 different types of things in my mind inside of Power Apps now. There's model-driven apps, there's Canvas apps, there's portals and bots, and all those kind of have this Power Apps umbrella on them. To me, they're almost 4 completely different things, even though they kind of are all labeled Power Apps, and they can interact with each other. So for those of you who don't know, the entire Dynamics 365 platform is essentially a very sophisticated Power App, and it's really the foundation that model-driven Power Apps came from. They're built kind of on top of that that infrastructure that was laid a long time ago, using the common data model for what they do. Canvas Power Apps, on the other hand, can get their data from a number of different resources. They don't necessarily sit on top of the common data model, although they can pull data from the common data model as well as many other sources. And they give you a little more exacting control over the user interface. So some power you can get to in Canvas apps that it's really hard to recreate in a purely model-driven app. Model-driven apps give you some power and structure that isn't in the designer experience for Canvas apps at this point. So the 2 of them together can be powerful. Portals and bots, totally different topic. Not going to talk about that today. What I am going to focus on are these 2 things. Helpful to you today is if you've done a little bit with either of these, or ideally with both of these, you're probably going to grasp what I'm saying in a little more detail. If you haven't, don't worry. I'm going to try to go at a pace where you can at least pick up a few tips. And in a couple of cases, I'll give you a push in the right direction to say, here's where to go to get more information. So here's our scenario. I always like to kind of say, here's something we might actually want to try to do in business with this. So our scenario is we're using Dynamics 365 for customer service, one of the modules, if you will, of Dynamics 365. And we need to give our entry-level customer service reps the ability to rapidly triage issues that are coming in without having to get too much training. And they can escalate or do whatever they need to do. And then based on that triage, then they need to basically say, hey, what are the follow-ups? What does this need to be handled? Do I need to promote it to somebody else? One assumption I'm making in this today, by the way, is for those of you who are Dynamics people or model-driven apps people, you kind of know there's 2 different ways to come at your model-driven app. You can go kind of through the legacy experience, or you can go more through the modern Power Apps experience. I'm doing as much in modern as I possibly can. So if you're a Dynamics person, you think this doesn't look familiar to me, it'll get familiar to you. And once it does, you'll kind of realize, here's how I can get to that same functionality using the path I already know. But I encourage you to go more modern, because I'm sure more and more of Microsoft's effort and support is going to be focused on that side. We're all going to need to go that way eventually. So the first thing, if you're going to do a Canvas app in a model-driven app, you need to design it. So 3 quick things to think about with design, of course, are what screens do you want? So how many different screens will I have? And particularly for something like this, I might have different screens that I branch to depending on how users answer questions and those kinds of things. What data is going to be needed? So where in my model-driven app is that data going to come from? What other data am I going to need to collect during the process? And then how and where do I want to do my embedding? Because we're talking about embedded Canvas apps today. So here's what I mean by that. There's 2 broad approaches. We're going to talk mostly about this one today. You can embed them in a model-driven form. And if you're going to do that, and that's kind of the more recent way Microsoft has announced it's the more supported way, you need to decide which entity will this live on, which essentially is a table. What form within that entity, because a table or an entity can have multiple forms. Will I create a tab, or does one already exist that I will put it on? And what section of that tab will it go on, or will I need to create a section for it? So that's the super high level design piece. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention to you that I just won't have time to cover today is you can do a pop-up Canvas app too. So old school dialogues were more like a pop-up, right? I'm on a form in a model-driven app. I go run a dialogue, gives me a bunch of them to choose from. I say that one, just kind of like that flow I demoed earlier in this session. And it pops up that dialogue and I go through that dialogue. I can do essentially the same thing with a Canvas app as well. That's not as supported, doesn't have as many embedded things in it. Hopefully that's something Microsoft's going to deliver at some point. For now, the easier approach is to do the embedded form. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Now, as you get into this, and I'm going to walk you through this, but one thing to remember is always start with a solution. So when I first started doing this, I thought, okay, I know this is possible, and I kind of went the paths I'm used to and said, let me start kind of designing my Power App, and then I'll go figure out how to put that into my solution. Well, I'm sorry, my Canvas Power App. And that can be done, but that makes it a lot more difficult. Much better approach that we'll walk through is start in your model-driven app, navigate to where your Canvas app will go to, do the magic to insert it in there, and then design your Canvas app from there. Link there with a little more information on that. Lots of good documentation from Microsoft on it. So we're inside of Power Apps now, right? The Power Apps Maker experience. And what you're going to want to do is, first of all, make sure you're in the environment you want to be in, probably dev or test or something like that, or some other model that you're using. You're going to go down to the solutions in your Power Apps, and you're going to create a new solution.
Quick question, Geoff.
Yeah.
Matt is asking, do you start with a new publisher each time?
Good question. In fact, you beat me to the punch, because right here is where it goes into that. But absolutely, you do not need to start with a new publisher each time. And by the way, thank you for interrupting me. I don't see the, I'm not good at watching and don't even see the way my screens are set up here, the chat, so feel free to jump in.
I got you, Geoff.
So when you create the new solution, there's what you do. And for us, we would say we're going to use C5 Insight as the same publisher all the time, right? Some people just use a default publisher. To me, the publisher is ideally the organization that's doing it. I work with some organizations that say, even if we're contracting it out, we want our company to be listed as a publisher. I've worked with others that say, we want the main developer to be the publisher. To me, it's the organization doing the development work should be listed as a publisher, but you only need to create that publisher record once. Great question. So you've created your solution, you filled in the basic blanks. When you're done with that and you click the create button, you're now going to see your solution in there. I named this case triage script. So then you're going to just click the solution to open it. And now you're going to add your components. You got a blank solution at the moment. There's nothing going on in it. So you're going to start in this case by saying, I'm in a model-driven app solution, and I want to modify one of the entities that already exists inside of this solution, inside of this model-driven app. It's not in the solution yet, though. So I'm going to add an existing item. That existing item is going to be type entity. Then it's going to give me a list of all my entities. I'm going to choose the case in this case. So cases are kind of the issue list in Dynamics 365. So I'm going to choose cases. I'm going to click next to add the cases. It's going to say, here's your cases. What components of case do you want to add? So I can actually have a lot of granular control. I can add everything. I can say, bring everything about cases in here. Better practice is to say, just bring in the parts that I'm going to need to modify. That way I've got a little more granular control over it. I can lock those down or not lock them down without impacting the broader item. I can always go back and add more things later. So if I add one form and I think, oh, I needed another one, you can go back and add that other form later if you want to. So I'm going to go over into the forms area now for the cases. I'm going to choose the case form, which is the main form for the case entity. I'm going to add that to my solution. Okay, backing up a little bit. If I go look at this a little more closely, I now have I have the main case form in here. This is what our solution looks like. You're going to open your form to edit it. So item number 16 there, that's my solution name. That's the solution I'm currently on. Item number 17, that's the entity name in the solution I'm going to configure. Item number 18, that's the tab showing me the forms for the case entity. Item number 19, that's the case form that I'm going to click on to say, open the form to edit it. All those numbers seem like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of steps. Once you do it a few times, you just kind of click through. It's very automatic and simple. Now on my case form, I say I need a home for this Canvas app I'm going to create. So forms and model-driven apps tend to have tabs on them. You can see the summary tab was at the very beginning. I've created a new tab. So item number 20, I clicked add a new component to this form. Item number 21, I said I want to add a tab to it. It's going to be a 3-column tab. So I added that 3-column tab. Item number 23, I gave it a name. And item number 24, I'm now going to switch to the classic experience. So this is where my modern Power Apps experience ends. And I'm about to go back into the classic view of an entity in a model-driven app. I have to do this. It's in the Microsoft documentation too, to get to the next step. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with these, I'll give you some bigger views of some of these forms in a minute. But essentially, on that form, I added a field, and it's the case title field. That's item number 25 there. So remember, I created that tab. I created a section. In the classic experience, I'm adding a field to the section. That field actually has to be a required field, right? The Power App is going to be triggered by this, and you have to have a field that's guaranteed to have a value in it. So usually you're going to choose something like the title field for the entity you're on to add to this. Don't worry, the field will actually be transparent. The user won't even know it exists. But for some reason, the way Microsoft set this up, it wants a field there as some kind of anchor to trigger this. So I'm going to add that field in there. Has to be a required field on the entity. Text field or something like that is generally the best practice. Now I'm going to click, I can double click the field, or I can click the properties link while I'm on that field to open up this dialog box to configure how that field works. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go uncheck the display label on the form, part of hiding this field from the user view, so I can get rid of that. Then in the dialog box, I'm going to go over and I'm going to click the Controls tab in the dialog box. Under the Controls tab, I'm going to add a control. So controls are basically ways that let me render fields and items on a form lots of different ways. And you can actually create your own controls if you're a developer, but there's a number of them available to you. So you're going to click Add a New Control that's going to bind to this field. You're going to get a pop-up dialog that looks like this. And here's where you're going to tell it, I want a Canvas app. So you've kind of gone through all this just to kind of say, insert a Canvas app here. That's basically what you're telling it. And it gives you some other information on there when you do it. But when you're done, nothing else to change at that point. Just click the Add button. You're back on this dialog that we were on earlier. And now you can see there's a new control added. You have text box control. You also have Canvas control. You're going to change the radio button on that to say the Canvas app will work with the web application. You will not change it for phone or tablet because embedded Canvas apps are not yet supported in phone and tablet clients, only on the web client. Hopefully that's coming soon. Now there's some other things in there with pencils next to them that look like maybe I should click these to modify them. Don't do that. It's going to take care of that for you automatically. Just come down here and click the checkbox saying hide the default control, so we don't have that case title field there confusing the user, and then click the customize button. Okay, so quick timeout. I'll stop and ask for any questions. Now, those of you who know Dynamics are kind of like, that was a lot of work just to tell me how to get to that. I knew how to do that already. Those of you who don't know model-driven apps are probably going, oh my gosh, that's a lot of stuff. But pretty simple step-by-step instructions once you get into it. You're next going to be dropped into a Canvas Power App, which I'm going to come back to in just a second. But let me just pause there and ask questions on that. Has anybody done an embedded Canvas app and a model-driven app yet?
Feel free to go off mute or ping
I've tried.
the chat.
Someone's tried?
Yeah, I tried. It was a lot of effort. So I'm eager to see what's next.
Okay, good. Yeah, and are you? And I'm sorry, I can't really see who's speaking, but are you a Dynamics person? So you kind of know the Dynamics front end. It was the Canvas part that was problematic.
I'm Power App's Canvas app guy. I came from SharePoint, so Dynamics is completely foreign to me. I'm getting used to it now, but
Okay.
Yeah, very, very much when I was trying to figure it out, I was like, wow, this seems really unnecessarily complicated.
Yeah, well, all those steps, I agree. As I got into it, I thought, you got to be kidding me. This is what I've got to go through to do this stuff. So I do not disagree with you. I hope this gets a lot smoother in the future. If you were someone who ever did Dialogs in Dynamics 365, as I was, I kind of thought, oh, this is a replacement. I guess it's time for me to look at this. It should be simple. No, dialogues are way easier to create than something like this. And for you, if you know Canvas apps, What I just did is probably the hard part. There's a few bindings that we'll talk about that might not have been totally straightforward, but if you know how to design a Canvas app, you can probably run circles from this point forward. Good stuff.
Cool.
Okay, so let's go in and talk about building the Canvas Power App. I'm going to do a couple things here before I just jump into building it. But my goal here is for someone who for someone who's never used model-driven apps, hopefully you're kind of like, oh, okay, now at least I know how to navigate into that app to do this. For someone who has never used Canvas apps, my goal is to say, at least I'm going to try to give you enough information that you can build your first basic embedded app if you already know model-driven or you already know dynamics. So first up, I'm not going to be able to do a ton of detail on learning how to create Canvas apps. One of the things I find really helpful if you want to learn Canvas apps for the first time, if you go to Power Apps and you go down to Create and you go down to the templates, look for the template called Power Apps Training. There's a ton of stuff in there that is super, super helpful. I went through that in a couple of videos, and literally, I mean, I've done a little bit of hacking in Canvas apps, and I've done some that are embedded in the SharePoint flyout and stuff like that I wouldn't really call Power Apps really, but I guess they are. And then I did some of this. And if you know anything about configuring model-driven apps or working in Excel with crazy formulas, you'll walk through this and you'll get the basics of it very quickly. We won't do all that tonight, but if you want to go a lot deeper really fast, that is a really great resource for someone who knows relatively little about Canvas-driven Power Apps. So I'm going to try to, this is a little video I'm going to play. I'm going to try to talk it through as it plays. Hopefully I'll be able to keep it up, but I just want to give you an idea of how this app is going to look in production before I go build the app. So let me, I'm in a model-driven app right now. So I'm on the case entity that we created. In this model-driven app, you can see there's a new tab I created called the Case Triage tab. On that tab, here is the embedded Power App that I created. You can actually see I've embedded a couple of pieces of information here that come from the parent app, the username and the name of the customer on this case. I added a few other fields to it on the right so you can see things update in real time. So you can see I just interacted with the embedded Power App. It asks me for some more information to verify the description the user gave me. So I add a little more information there. I click Save Changes. Notice how those changes immediately updated the parent app directly from within the Canvas app. Notice also as I click these different radio buttons, very simple stuff here, but some options come up that might be variable scripting things I can prompt the user with. Going back to the beginning again, let's take the other path and say now is not a good time to talk. So I pop another screen in the embedded Canvas app and I say, do you want to reschedule or do you just want to close this issue out? Now notice when they say yes, reschedule, I'm actually able to open a quick create form on the parent model-driven Power App. This is parent app, model-driven app functionality, not the Canvas app, but I can interact with the parent app that way. I click no, close the issue. Instead, get some different variable text here. It says, hey, if you're going to close it, if you want to update the name of the case, you can do that. If you want to change the status of the case, you can do that. If you want to make some changes to the description, you can do all of that. So I'm just going to change the description back to kind of what it was before I made the other edit. And watch when I hit save, not only are you going to see this information update, but at the bottom of the form, you're actually going to see the form's state change to canceled, which in a model-driven Power App, that basically means it is now read-only. So it's kind of going through some machinations behind the scene to say, this is done. It's kind of in the recycle bin. You're not going to use it anymore. So trying to give you an example of very rapidly how something like this can work in a really simple use case. You could, of course, blow this way out and do much more sophisticated stuff with it, but we're going to focus just on some of the basics now. So, whoops, video's playing again. So let's go and move forward. So remember, we left off at clicking that create button inside of the model-driven Power App experience to create the Canvas app. So as soon as we do that, this is the Canvas app we're presented with. This literally pops open. This Canvas app is open, and everything you see on the screen is there out of the box. I didn't add anything to it. Now, if you look at that tree view, you see something in there that says model-driven form integration. You can't really change that, but you can interact with it. And that's all the machinery that says, talk to this to pull in any data from that parent form and to push things back out to that parent application to make things happen. And it also gives you this form. I have no idea how it decided what fields go on that form, but it put a bunch of fields on that form for me and said, here it is. This is data that's actually pulled directly in from your app. If you were to go run this right now, you'd see it. You wouldn't be able to do much with it. There's no way to save your changes or anything, but it's a starting point. So this app, by the way, is now auto added to your solution. You don't need to go add it to your solution. You'll save it eventually and it will show up in your solution for you. It can display and update information from that parent model-driven app, that Dynamics app. And as you saw, it can interact with that app to an extent as well. So let's go now start configuring it. For me, non-developer guy, so if you're further along in this with me and you're saying, oh my gosh, that's not a best practice, forgive me for it. I usually do these things more for learning experiences, good enough to be strategic, not so good that you'd ever want me to actually do them for you. But what I did first is I said, I don't want to disrupt that form it created for me, because that's got a lot of stuff in it that I might want to refer back to later. I don't think I'll use that form though. So I created a whole bunch of other screens and said, I modeled out my app. I've got a bunch of screens in it. I'm going to go create all of those screens now. For the most part, they were blank. I put a few things in one before I captured the screenshot. But I go create all of my Power App screens. So screens, if you're new to Canvas-driven Power Apps, screens are, I want to say kind of like forms, but there's a different thing called forms. So screens are literally the different screens that the user will see as they navigate around your app. Forms can be inside of screens and help you to connect the data. Couple other quick tips here that really helped me. One is I actually put a version number right at the top of the home screen of my app. And I did that. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But I did that because sometimes you might not realize that you have not published the latest version. Even if you've clicked publish, you may not be working with the latest version. Super helpful to me to realize I'm testing the version I think I'm testing and not some other version. So simple tip there to kind of help you keep your work straight. At some point, probably early on, you should go ahead and save your app. So you can just go to the file area in Power Apps, you go down to save, you're going to save it to the cloud, you're going to give it a name, and you're going to click save. Just make sure you do that every time before you publish it. You're going to save it too. As soon as you save it, there's a publish button. If you need to publish it, click publish, and you can go do your testing. So here's I've kind of focused this particular screenshot on the center part of the form design and then the formula bar at the top of the page. So looking at this formula bar, this was very challenging for me to figure out how to do this. Developers might be rolling their eyes at me, but I wanted to have this nice personal message that told the person to say, hi, my name is, and to say your name as the user. And then to say, may I speak with, and to say the name of the contact that's listed on the case. So how do I do that? So first of all, this was just one big formula for the text field. So I just said text equals quote, put it all in there, and then use ands to connect the formulas within it. First formula was simple. I just inserted user parens dot full name. That gets the context of the user that's running the Power App, and we'll display it on the form for you. That one was pretty easy. This one, a little more difficult. It is buried in the documentation somewhere, but when you see how I can pull in forms, fields from the parent model-driven app entity, it's generally much easier than this. But if any of those fields are lookup fields, such as the contact name on this form is actually a lookup to a whole separate entity that lists contacts. And unfortunately, it's not as simple as just saying, get me the name out of that field. I have to look up the contact record and get the name off of that record. Here is the syntax for doing that. It is listed in the Microsoft documentation. Even though it's listed, it was still tricky for me to read it carefully enough to get it structured the right way. Spent a lot of time on that. So make sure you understand that closely. You will want to do that. That's almost never a maybe. That's a you're going to want to do this every time you write one of these, and that's a little bit of a pain. Now, the nice thing is once I've done that lookup, instead of full name, I could go get any field I wanted to get off of that contact entity. So if I said, hey, I want to confirm your phone number, I could get the phone number using that same syntax. All I've got to do is change full name to whatever the name of the field is on the entity I want to get it from. And then behind the buttons on here, this is just straight Canvas Power App stuff. But I just said, hey, when the user selects that, my formula is on select, navigate to whatever screen name I want to navigate to. So in this case, if they say, yes, now's a good time to talk, I'm going to go to the issue triage screen. If they say, no, it's not a good time to talk, I'm going to navigate to some other screen. Now I'm on the schedule follow-up. So this was the screen I got to when they said, no, this is not a good time. So in the tree view, I go down to the screen I created, start adding the information I want to that. On this button, I created an on select that basically says, if you read all that, it says model-driven form integration dot open quick create form phone call. So if you remember in the demo, when I click this, I got a fly out on the side, which is called a quick create form, something available in model-driven apps. It's not a Canvas-driven app thing. It's a model-driven app thing. Really cool here, though. I could say, oh, I need to schedule a follow-up call with this person. Well, if I could build all of that into my Canvas app with what's the time and the date and all that kind of stuff that I want to capture. But there's a form already in the model-driven app that does all of that for me. And it would be nice to not have to recreate that. This is how I do it. And remember, I said that in the tree view, this thing called model-driven form integration, that's an action. That's a object that Microsoft created for you when it did the embedded app. So all I'm doing is I'm calling this up. IntelliSense works. So as soon as I start typing it and hit the dot, it gives me some options. This is one of my options. Oh, I can open a quick create form. Which one do I want? I put it in quotes over there. And it opens, by the way, the default quick create form. So if I have 2 for phone call, it's going to go to the first one on the default list. So real cool way I can interact with the parent application a little bit. Okay, now looking down at the no close this issue, I set up another item that basically made that bottom form visible. That bottom form was hidden. I set that to be visible when the user clicked that. Now on that form, I set the data source to cases. So again, if you don't know Canvas apps, when you create a form, you have this idea of a data source for your form. Now, the model-driven integration automatically put that data source out there for me. So I didn't have to go find a data source and do all that. All I had to do is click the drop down and it said, hey, cases is what you were on when you created this Canvas app. So cases is available to you. So I just clicked cases. Now that form is bound to cases. No more work needed than that. I want to put some fields on that form. Well, right below that data source, there's this fields link here. I just click edit fields. I get a pop-up and I can choose which fields I want on the form and what sequence I want those fields in. And all those fields are coming from that parent application, from the case entity on the parent application. The last thing I have to do to make sure that I'm showing the right record is up here on the item property for the form, I need to set the formula to model-driven form integration .item. And all that says is whatever item you told me you were on when you called this up, that's the item I want to display right now. Or that's the record I want to display right now. Might sound like it makes more sense. Bottom item there on the save button. So remember, the user might have made some changes to this. So I want to make sure I save this form after the user has done their changes. So the user has to click that save button. Now the Microsoft documentation says use this command to save it behind the save button, to save whatever is going on back to the parent application. A lot of research later told me that does not always reliably work. I'm not sure why. It seems to work if I use it on that default form that was created when I first created the Canvas app. Does not seem to work so well when I use other forms. What does seem to work reliably is just use the regular Canvas Power App submit form and then the name of the form to save the form. Works just as well, seems to work every single time. Takes less typing too. So simple one to set up. The other thing to do is if I want those changes to be visible in the parent form right after they save, use this model-driven form integration command, refresh form true. And now it's going to refresh that form for you so that almost instantly when the user hits save, they're going to see the parent form update. And then the last command I put in there was to navigate to the next screen in the script form. Quick timeout for what are these model-driven form integration actions? I've already hit a couple of them. Let me just kind of hit the full list for you. So there's navigate to a main form. So what this will allow you to do is actually navigate on the model-driven app to a completely different record. So use case for this might be, hey, they're done solving this case. but maybe I need to drop them back into the account that this case was under because they need to add some notes to it or create a new case for it or whatever it is. I can do that. I can navigate that parent app to something completely different. Now, remember, they're not going to be on the Power App anymore because it's embedded in that form. So you probably only want to do that if you're pretty sure they're done with the embedded Power App. Similarly, I can navigate to a view. Use case for that might be when I say I'm done with this case, maybe I just take the user back to the view of open cases so they can continue processing their queue without having to go do a couple of more clicks. You already know about the open quick create form. You already know about the refresh form, and you already know just say no to the save form on this and use submit form instead. If you want to go look at all of those commands, there's a shortcut link to get you to them. Okay, back into our app. Let's finish building it out here, the last few screens. So now we're on this issue triage screen. You can kind of see the tree view over there as well as the designer view. So first thing I did on this is I said, okay, on this screen, one thing I want to do is I want to clear out those radio buttons when the user comes to the screen. And that's because if I don't, it's going to remember the value that was entered the last time the user was on the screen. And that value is driving the script. I don't want them to see that script. That'll mess them up. So all I do is say, when this form becomes visible, and the on visible property of this form, I'm just going to reset the radio button. It blanks it out and nothing shows up down here. Now, in reality, you're probably going to do something much more sophisticated than a quick sentence based on what they answer. You might branch to entirely different screens, but the logic and the flow is more or less the same. So I wanted to get it in here so you could see how that works. Now, if you want to actually define the values for sort of a data component like a radio button, they tend to want to connect to a data source, right? So it tends to want to say, show me where this list of radio buttons is. Is it in Excel or a model-driven app or somewhere else so I can populate this for you? But you might want to create a fixed list here without having to connect to a data source. To do that, all you do is you define your items property for the radio one. You put a bracket and a closing bracket, and you list all of your items with quote, comma separation. So I just manually created these in here. Now, if you wanted to create a really robust call scripting application, you might even create a separate application that allows a scripting design feature, and then maybe you actually feed these from that scripting design feature. I didn't want to get that sophisticated today, so we kept it really simple. Now, this label field that you see here at the bottom, that changes based on what the user has clicked on any one of these given radio buttons. I just used a big, ugly, nested if statement to do that. Probably switch would be a more elegant and best practice way to do it. In reality, probably what you're going to do is more link the logic down here to the button and branch to different forms based on what the user entered. But just as an example, if you're looking for a way to play around with it, there's a way you can do a nested if statement to do some of that. This button on the bottom, I set the visible property based on whether the radio button, sorry, the screenshot is over it now, is populated or not. So I don't want the user to be able to click done until they've clicked that radio button and read the rest of the script. And again, this is just standard Canvas Power App stuff. This works the same whether I'm doing it embedded in a model-driven app or not. Just trying to give you some of the tools you can use to create a Canvas app if you never have before. So basically, I said, don't want to see that done button until I've gone through all the steps I need to go through before I move on to the next step. Our Power App is pretty much built now. So everything I've shown you is really what was done to create that little video I just played for you. Couple little debugging tips. I mentioned this first one to you before. Have a version number. Every time you save, after you click the save button, that little screen immediately gets replaced with this one that says, do you want to publish? You click publish. So every time you make a change and you want to test it, go change your version number, save, publish. Now, the nice thing is you can have a totally separate version, a totally separate window or tab with your model-driven app running in it. So I don't have to go save and publish this and go back to my solution and publish that. No, all you got to do is you publish your Canvas-driven app. So just save, publish, then go over to your other screen that you've got your model-driven app running on. You're probably going to hit a refresh to refresh your browser to make sure that you've got the latest information in it. In this case, what I do is I navigate to the record, and I do that by clicking cases. I get a view. I'd click on the case I want to open. I click on the case triage form, and I would look at this. And I can tell you about 50% of the time, it was still on the last version that I published. Maybe I was doing something wrong and there's a better way to do it. But once I started using the versioning numbers, it was very nice to go, nope, that's still not working. I don't have to republish. I just go back, re-navigate to the case, or hit the refresh button once more. And about 100% of the time, the second time around, it refreshed and I was using the right thing. But I tell you, it's really frustrating if you go debug and say, man, that change I just made didn't work at all. I don't know what I did wrong. And then you go change something else again, and then it works. And what's working is still a version ago, and you're all messed up. So use the version numbers to make sure that you're keeping in sync with the changes you make. Now, remember to practice good development practices, right? I did all of this in a test environment and didn't worry about migration or anything like that. But when you bundle everything up into a solution, ideally you're working in a development environment, you export that solution, then you can import that solution into your other environments, test, prod, whatever it is that you're going to. But make sure you follow the right sequence of things to get those things done well. And also remember, you have to share everything, right? So this Canvas Power App you created, just because it's in your solution does not mean the people who are accessing the case entity have permission to access the Canvas app you just created. So in the Canvas app, make sure you use sharing to share it out with everyone it needs to be shared with. If you tap into any other data that they don't have permission to get into, maybe it's model-driven app data, maybe it's data from some other source, they're going to get errors, they're going to get, site not found or whatever if you haven't done all the sharing correctly. So make sure you do the sharing. If you're used to building dashboards in a model-driven app where you're like, I have to share the view and I have to share the chart and I have to share the dashboard for them to see everything in it, you're kind of familiar with what I'm talking about here. Few limitations. We're doing great on time. I'm just a few minutes over, so I'm about to wrap up.
One really quick question that came in.
Yeah.
Geoff, should we ever import as a managed solution, or is that just asking for trouble?
That is almost always just asking for trouble. In my view, and it's been a while since I've looked at them, so I'll confess my information might be a little bit out of date on it, but I talked to some of our developers about it. I think this is still accurate. When you create a managed solution, essentially it says that is locking certain things down so that you cannot change them in that managed solution. The only way to change those things now is to go back to kind of your source environment and change it there and then re-import the managed solution. Well, I've encountered situations where a managed solution was installed and they thought this is great, it's in production, now no one can mess with my production environment. And then someone lost the old unmanaged solution and there was no way of rolling those changes back. If you delete the managed solution out, you delete everything out that's in that managed solution. Managed solutions are really kind of for ISVs. So if you're creating something that you're bundling up and reselling, sure, you probably want to use a managed solution. If you're creating something for internal use, or you're a consultant or you are a consultant creating something for someone else's internal use and they own full rights to it, my experience has been that should always be an unmanaged solution. There might be other opinions out there, I'm open to them, but that's my latest thinking on it. Great question. Solutions are, yeah, I kind of forget that those are a little bit different for folks who work in Canvas apps versus model-driven apps, and they can get a little complex. So remember this, all of this only works embedded, right? So I started from the very beginning saying, if you're going to embed, go into the model-driven app and start building out from there. If you want to create a pop-up dialog, you will not follow these instructions. You will create a separate Canvas app, and you will call that differently, and you will pass information to it differently. So very different process for that. More complex. Hope Microsoft makes both of these simpler than they are right now. But at least once I got my head around this one, I could work it as a guy who's more or less citizen developer level person. I could get my head around it enough to do it. It only works in a unified interface web app. The old legacy web app, no. Tablet, mobile, no. You get only in the unified interface web app. Only one embedded app per form. Can't have two embedded apps side by side. It's going to throw an error. I'll have to activate one and deactivate another. You can have multiple embedded apps in a model-driven app, but on any given form, you can only have one embedded app. Triggered field, as we said, must have a value and be text. It won't be displayed on new records until they're saved, which makes sense because there's no record, there's no context yet for it. So once you create the record and save it, then the Canvas app shows up inside of it. And remember that funky lookup operation I had to do to display fields that are on a related entity, right? I can easily display fields on the regular entity that I'm bound to, in this case, the case entity. But the case entity has relationships to account and contact and a lot of other things. If I want to display that information, funky looking code I have to put in there to do it. It's not totally unmanageable, but it's a little difficult and tricky, particularly for a borderline developer like me. Last slide here. I just happened to watch a presentation at the D365 UG earlier this week or last week. And this guy went through some awesome embedded Power Apps, Canvas Power Apps they've created in their CRM at Star Tribune. So if you're looking for some really good examples of in production embedded Power Apps, go watch this video. I don't even have a link to it yet. It was literally, I guess, a day or two ago. But go to the D365 UG online, log in, look at the recorded videos if you're a member, and check his out. It's not how-to at all, but it's all these great use cases of all this great stuff that these guys have done. So some great examples there if you're looking for some of that kind of context. And there's my contact information again. I'm going to switch over quickly, let Ashley start while she's starting up. If you guys want to ask some questions, you can. Couple of quick things to point out here. If you're interested, if you're looking or you know somebody who is, we're looking for developers. So would love to hear from you or anyone you want to refer to us. A couple of free ebooks for you if you're interested in a digital workplace ROI ebook to convince seniors to invest in a digital workplace, or how to do better governance of Microsoft Teams. Those are free. Just ping me on my email and I'll get you copies of those. And of course, if you're an end client and you're looking for someone to help you with all this stuff, I and a bunch of other people at this session are here for you. Happy to connect with you on those things.